Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christine Chen, Executive Director for Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote. Thank you for joining us today so we can update everyone on the state of voting rights across the country, the importance of it, and how you could help with this effort. It is really up to all of us to keep the attention on ensuring that all voters have access to the ballot box. This past week, we heard President Biden at the State of the Union address call on the Senate once again to pass the Freedom to Vote Act and pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. In the meanwhile, APAC Vote has been reaching out to the administration for further clarification on their March 7th, 2021 executive order to promote an all-of-government effort to promote voter participation. Agencies are to assess how they can provide information on voting and provide opportunities to register and vote. It is essentially time for all of us to think outside the box and reassess what tools and power do we have access to. Today, we are fortunate to have many of our longtime friends joining us. Kicking off the conversation will be Bob Sakoniwa, our Director of Policy, and John Yang, President and Executive Director of Asian American Advancing Justice, AAJC. API Vote and Advancing Justice AAJC runs the 888 API Vote Asian Hotline together. And we saw the increase of calls in 2020 and 2021 due to the increasingly confusing rules on how to cast a vote early or by mail. We need federal protections as certain state rolls back strides as we made an increasing voter participation. Followed by that conversation, we have two trailblazers providing their wisdom and leadership. This includes Senator Mazie Hirono, our first Asian American female elected to the Senate while representing Hawaii, and her seat on the Judiciary Committee has given her the platform to be a champion for voting rights. We're also joined by Congresswoman Judy Chu from California 27. Congresswoman Chu is our first Chinese American woman elected to Congress, and for the last decade, she continues to chair the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. So let's get started by sharing a short clip from today's everyday voters in our community expressing their thoughts on the need to fight for voting rights.
Your everyday life is impacted by how you vote.
It's pivotal to uplifting our voices and uplifting our needs.
Why are you limiting access to the drop boxes or reducing early voting times or making it harder to send in a mail-in ballot?
This does affect me. This does affect everyone I know.
I see the impact of being involved in the political process, and that includes voting.
We should not allow our access to the polls and our rights to vote to be attacked.
Great. What a inspiring video and nice way to start this discussion. We're very fortunate today to have John with us. He is, as Christine mentioned, President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. John testified just last fall at a Senate Judiciary hearing on restoring the Voting Rights Act, combating discriminatory abuses. I think he is the perfect person to help set the context for us to understand what the Voting Rights Act is all about and why we need voting rights legislation today. So, John, let me first start by asking you, what is the brief history of the Voting Rights Act? I know it's a long and storied history, but if you can give us a snapshot of that, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Bob. And thanks to Christine and API Vote for having me. It's always wonderful to work in partnership with all of you. And so for people that are watching, especially if you don't know about the history, very briefly, why do we have this Voting Rights Act? Some people would say, well, the 15th Amendment guaranteed everyone the right to vote. Didn't that solve things? And the reality is, no, it didn't. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 15th Amendment guaranteed everyone the right to vote. But what happened very quickly after that, as many of you know, was there were all sorts of restrictions put on, especially on African Americans, Black Americans' ability to vote through literacy tests, through poll taxes. For those of you that know sort of colloquialisms, the grandfather clause actually originated because of voting restrictions. that what that refers to were laws enacted at that time that said that people whose grandfathers already voted do not have to take literacy tests, are not subject to poll taxes. So when we think about being grandfathered into something, frankly, I think we should think about how racist some of America has been and how far we still have to go. So that's why we still needed more legislation. In 1964, we passed an amendment that said that poll taxes were eliminated, that outlawed poll taxes, but we knew that there were still all sorts of restrictions. So because of famed heroes like Martin Luther King, John Lewis, the famous Edmund Pettus Bridge, we got to a point that we had this new Voting Rights Act that was passed in 1965 that guaranteed greater protections for all Americans to have the ability to vote.
Wow, so that sounds like maybe a 100-year span there till we finally get to the 65 Act. But nothing happens quickly, as we've learned recently, and this is a long fight. How has the Voting Rights Act helped protect voting rights for AAPIs?
Sure. So I'm going to break down the Voting Rights Act into 4 distinct segments. One is what's called Section 203. One is called Section 208. One is called Section 2, and one is called Section 5. But I'll make this easy. So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act basically allows people to sue when there's some sort of discriminatory practice that is implemented against a voting system, right? And this suit can be by a private party. So, for example, my organization is involved in voting rights lawsuits, whether it's in Georgia, at times we've been involved in Arizona, where we see some type of discrimination for us, particularly against the Asian American community. So that would be what's called a Section 2 voting rights case. There's another thing called Section 5. Under Section 5, a certain defined set of what we call jurisdictions or areas have been determined to have had a history of discriminatory voting laws. And for those jurisdictions, what traditionally had to happen was they had to get pre-approval from the U.S. Department of Justice before they changed their voting laws. The understanding was that these jurisdictions historically always had problems, and so they need to get approval. They need to mediate with the government to make sure that any changes they made did not discriminate against that community there. The other 2 provisions, especially of interest to Asian Americans, is what's called Section 203 and Section 208. Section 203 guarantees that if you have 5% of your population that speaks a language other than English and doesn't speak English proficiently, then you must have ballots and ballot materials translated into that language. So, for example, I live in Fairfax County in Virginia. If we have over 5% of the population, which we do, that is Asian American, and that 5% is also limited English proficient, then you must have, let me be a little bit more clear. If you had 5% of the population that was, let's say, Korean American speaking and limited English proficient, then you must have ballots translated into Korean for this population. The other place that it would qualify is if you have a jurisdiction that had over 10,000 people of that language group. So that's Section 203. The last provision that's useful for all of us is what's called Section 208. That ensures that if you don't speak English proficiently, you're allowed to bring someone to the polls with you that can help you navigate that poll. And it's called an assister of your choice. And that helps both language minority groups as well as people that have physical disabilities. Now, what's important to note here is that person does not have to be a citizen. That person does not have to be a voter in that jurisdiction. The only requirements is that person cannot be your employer, and that person cannot be a union representative for a union that you belong to. Otherwise, you could even bring your teenage son or daughter to help you at the polls.
Great. That sounds like a extremely beneficial provision, especially for our communities. Now, obviously, things have happened in the last 10 years or so. The Supreme Court especially has taken away some of these underpinnings that you're talking about. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the Supreme Court has been doing in the last 10 years and how it's affected the Voting Rights Act?
Sure. I mean, one of the reasons why we're all talking about the need for passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act now is because of the Supreme Court. So in 2013, the Supreme Court, in a case called Shelby County, basically nullified our ability to use Section 5, this pre-clearance notion of getting DOJ approval before you could change voting laws. What they said was that the rationale, sort of the coverage formula, what they call the formula that was used to determine what states, what jurisdictions must get pre-clearance was outdated. Now, mind you, this was a law that was passed in 2006 with 98 senators voting for it, no senators voting against it. Some similar margin in the House. I think it was around 430 members of the House voted for it, maybe 30 odd members voted against it. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court back in 2013, Chief Justice Roberts said that that they should look beyond that history and ask for a more discerning inquiry from Congress. So as a result, we needed to bring forth the laws that we're looking at today. So that's one key decision. The second key decision more recently is a case called Brinovich that was issued last year that frankly has made it even harder for us to bring some of these types of discriminatory lawsuits. Basically, the court, I'm going to try to simplify, is saying, well, even if there's some discriminatory impact, that's okay if the state or if the local legislature can justify it in other ways. And it seemed to give great credence to the idea that, the burden on the state makes a difference. So that if the burden on the state is somewhat high, it's okay to discriminate against certain people. So that's the second case that that really caused the need for this voting rights reform. The last one that I'm going to mention, although we're not sure where it's going to go, is a very recent decision that basically said that private litigants can't sue under Section 2. Now, when I say private litigants, that means groups like mine, is that the only people that should be suing for voting rights violations is the Department of Justice. Now, frankly, it's hard enough to have groups like ours file the lawsuits. They require intense amount of staffing, great resources for experts and the like. But to say that we can't do it and only the federal government can do it really starts to change the equation about what these cases look like. And frankly, that's why we're seeing so many new voter oppression laws, voter suppression laws, is because these states where otherwise they would have had to get pre-approval from the Department of Justice can just do it on their own. And we're seeing the effects of that, whether it's in Georgia, whether it's in Texas, whether it's in Arizona, in terms of really restricting people's right to vote.
Yeah, it almost seems like the Supreme Court in some of these cases were giving the green light to turn the clock back on some of this on a law that had been working just fine. But I guess that's why we have things like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, which of course has been creatively combined into one bill, the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. And I'm wondering if you can mention a couple of provisions. I know it's two bills mashed together now, but some of the ones that are good for the Voting Rights Act, and then which you touched on, and maybe some of the provisions that are helpful in terms of voter access.
Sure, right. So some of the provisions that help with respect to voter access, establishes what we would call a baseline with respect to what governments must do in allowing, for example, mail-in ballot periods, absentee ballots, automatic voter registration. Because what's happening right now is, as you all know, there are higher barriers being created. Among other things, we are seeing law with respect to voter IDs. And what this legislation would do is say that, yes, there are certain voter IDs that might be okay, but you must have all sorts of different forms. For example, a lot of these laws start to require, in their extreme forms, exact matches between a driver's license and a social security number. And all of you probably know, especially when we're talking about Asian American languages, how many of us have exact matches between a driver's license, a social security number, a passport, and then the cost that would be needed to get them all to match. Actually, I know from personal experience that just doesn't happen automatically. Then we're also talking about mail-in ballots. Asian Americans over the 2020 election favored mail-in ballots by far with respect to our method of voting. But what we saw in Texas, I know we have at least one person watching from Texas, we had extraordinary levels of rejection of mail-in ballots during this past period. And so what the Freedom to Vote Act portion of this legislation would do is, again, establish uniform measures so that we could have greater access to mail-in ballots. So those are some of the provisions that are really key to our community. Because frankly, part of this, it's just fundamental to our democracy, is this notion that, people that are eligible to vote we should be maximizing, the ability to vote. We should not be putting additional restrictions on them. I mean, that's what's good for democracy.
Absolutely. And of course, this, again, combined bill also addresses some of the Voting Rights Act turnbacks. Can you quickly mention that again?
Sure. So on the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act side, a couple of key things. One would be restoring this Section 5 coverage formula, updating the formula so that it would pass Supreme Court scrutiny. Again, so that certain jurisdictions would have to get pre-clearance, pre-approval from the Department of Justice. And frankly, when you do that, sort of some of us have talked about this as just as a very efficient way to conduct elections. Is you get pre-approval, you go through what we would consider a mediation process. It avoids costly litigation later, and it solves the problems early on. And there's two pieces of this. One would be what we would call sort of practice-based provisions. And then there's another that's sort of historical provisions. So practice-based provisions is where sort of we've seen certain practices that always discriminate against minorities, whether they are voter ID laws, whether they are whether they are different types of provisions regarding mail-in ballots and the like. And so those provisions, even if one jurisdiction historically has not used it, we know that historically those have been used against communities. And therefore, we would ask the Department of Justice to pre-approve it before that change is made. So those are some of the key provisions with respect to the Voting Rights Advancement Act.
Great. I think it clearly underscores why this legislation is so important. And it's a bit frustrating to see it currently stalled. But there's another bill that we've heard a little bit about. I'm not sure how familiar you are with it. It deals with a law called the Electoral Account Act. And it sounds voting related, but can you give us a little background on that?
Sure. So as you all know, the 2020 election, that gave rise to the big lie. And I will be direct in saying it was a big lie. That sort of this notion that somehow, we had rampant election fraud. And it gave rise to this notion that somehow, the vice president or state legislatures had the ability to stop this election fraud. And so what the Electoral Account Act does is tries to clean up some of that to make it crystal clear that the vice president cannot overturn a national election, to make it crystal clear that a single governor cannot substitute a group of electoral college electors for the democratic will of the people in that state. So that's what the Electoral Account Act is about. Now, without meaning to be partisan, we are seeing Republicans try to say that this is, voter election reform. Yes, it does deal with elections, but it has nothing to do with voting. It has nothing to do with trying to protect the ability of people to vote. And so sort of the frustration right now is that we have a situation where traditionally voting rights laws have been bipartisan. Like I said, in 2006, 98-0, it was a high bipartisan count. Frankly, every time the Voting Rights Act has been reauthorized, because we do need to change the formulas every few years, it has always been signed actually by a Republican president, not a Democratic president. It's always been bipartisan until this past year. And so that's what's been frustrating about that. But I would say don't get fooled by this Electoral Account Act. That currently has nothing to do with some of these voting rights reforms that we're talking about.
So it's in your view, then it's not really a replacement for it, even if there's, minimal buzz around it.
It's not a replacement. Now, there is some talk among the legislators about trying to incorporate some of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act features, incorporate some of the Freedom to Vote Act features of those two bills into the Electoral Account Act. So you may see some news about that. We'll see how that goes, because if you see legislators willing to do that, I have my serious doubts about it. Then maybe this Electoral Account Act, number one, I would suggest that the bill needs to be renamed, but then it might have some teeth that actually protects voters. But until we see, a certain group of legislators willing to actually have meaningful talks there, I would say it's not a substitute at all.
Great. That is great to get the clarification, because we don't want people to be excited about something moving if it's not actually going to address some of our key concerns.
Right. Now, to be clear, certainly the Electoral Account Act is worthy of passage in itself, because it does clean up some of these things that emanate from the big lie. But that's a very different discussion than what we're talking about with respect to actual legislation that would push back against the voter suppression efforts that we've seen.
Right. We want to be able to cast our vote before anyone gets the opportunity to count them, I guess. Right. That's really a clear distinction for us. I really appreciate that, John. And I think you've given us a lot of food for thought here. And I think our next panel is ready. So at this point, thank you for giving us a lesson in the history and the legal framework of what we're talking about. And hopefully we'll continue the fight forward as 2022 progresses. Thank you so much, John. We are really honored today and happy that Senator Mazie Hirono and Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus Chair Judy Chu are going to be with us to have this conversation about voting rights. The House has been consistently passing critical voting rights legislation for the past few years, only to see their work sit at the desk in the Senate. Earlier this year, there was finally some action in the Senate, but after a valiant effort to debate the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, the bill stalled again when the Senate could not end the filibuster. Where are we now in the effort to pass voting rights legislation? Through this conversation, we'll hear from Senator Hirono, CAPAC Chair Judy Chu regarding their thoughts on voting rights, the current state of play legislatively, and what we need to do as a community to keep the fight going. 2022 is a crucial election year, and we need to make sure the APA community is as engaged in this cycle as we were in 2020. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Senator Hirono. And Senator, if I might kick off the questions here by asking you, what does the right to vote mean to you? And more broadly, why is the right to vote so important to the AAPI community? Welcome, Senator.
Thank you very much. And it was great to see John Yang. I have worked with John for what seems like decades, but maybe not that long. So it's always good to have John talk with all of us about these issues. In an environment where our right to vote is under assault, with hundreds and hundreds of bills being introduced in state legislatures all across the country, with possibly the exception of Hawaii, this just highlights and points out how important the vote is, because there are groups of people who are trying to take away our very right, our fundamental right to vote. And so if there's anything that shows us that our votes matter, it is this effort to make it so much tougher for people from our community, minority groups, from the Black community to vote. I've been voting since I turned 18. I could hardly wait to vote. And when I ran my first campaign in 1970, before many of you were even born, and my candidate lost by not very many votes, sure. Every election that I've worked on has pointed out how important every single vote is. And clearly we have to fight back against all of the voter suppression legislation being introduced as well as enacted across our country.
That is so true, Senator. And, you know, the legislation that's been pending in the Senate would have solved a lot of these issues, of course, but after your valiant effort to debate and end the debate so we could actually have a vote on the measure, of course, you were thwarted in that effort. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and process?
There is a group of us, of course. Hi, Judy. Thank goodness that the House passes these bills so that we can at least try to get them on the agenda for a vote. But we do know that for most of these cases, we need 60 votes in order to even get to a debate. This is an instance where we were able to use a process where we could at least debate, but we did not have the requisite votes to move the bill along. And that's why, to me, one of the attendant bills that we should be, or issues we should be talking about, not a bill, but a change in the Senate rules so that we can either totally eliminate the filibuster, which I support as a remnant of Jim Crow, but at least to carve out exceptions for some very fundamental issues such as voting rights and, in my view, a woman's right to choose. So filibuster reform, in my mind, is very much part and parcel of what we should be pushing for in order to move bills along, so many of which have come to us from the House. So as I said, the 50-50 Senate sucks, and we are in the process of elections, and this is going to be an election where we need to contend with the possibility of losing both the House and the Senate. That would be horrible for people of our country. And so truly every vote matters. And people may feel dejected, or they may feel as though it's somehow, you feel very negative about things, but this is a very time when all of us have to get off our okoles, as we say in Hawaii. You know what okole is, right? We have to get off our okoles to make sure that we continue the fight. And I thank all of you for recognizing that and doing what we need to do to make sure that our people vote in spite of the dozens of voter suppression bills that have been enacted in states across our country.
Thank you so much, Senator. And I'd like to ask Congresswoman Judy Chu, who we're so thankful was able to join us today as well. I think we got started a little bit early, so you were perfectly on time. Thank you. I want to ask the same question I just asked Senator Hirono, which is, what does the right to vote mean to you? And more broadly, why is it so important for the AAIP community to keep fighting for it? And even, as we see so many bad state laws get passed these days.
The right to vote is so important to me because I know from so many examples throughout history that if our voices aren't heard, then our rights are taken away. And I know that we wouldn't have had the most discriminatory law ever passed, a Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. We wouldn't have had the imprisonment of Japanese Americans during World War II. If we actually had elected officials who were responsive to us, if we had representatives of our own community elected to Congress, we wouldn't have had that happen if we were able to raise our voices as strongly as I know that we can. And I think about my grandfather who came to this country with nothing. He decided to make something of his life anyway. He opened up a small Chinese restaurant in Watts and worked night and day and night. The American story where he was able to support his family. But so many of his rights were restricted because of that Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, including not being able to vote, because that law stopped naturalized residents from that were of Chinese descent from becoming U.S. citizens, so they could not vote. Now, I am proud that I was able to become the first Chinese American woman elected to Congress, but I oftentimes reflect on the fact that it took 150 years of us being in this country for this to happen. Why is that? Well, we were disenfranchised. And now things just have to change. We have to be able to get our voices heard, because when that happens, then you can have the ability to assert your rights when the worst happens, and also move the agenda forward for people of color and AAPIs throughout this country.
Congresswoman, you raised an excellent point regarding the overlap of discriminatory immigration laws and how that silenced our ability to have a vote. And I think what we all know is voting rights is historically seen as an African-American issue. And of course, that's where the fight had been up through the Voting Rights Act of 1965 being passed. But clearly, it's important to all Americans. And as we see voter suppression laws proliferate across the country, my question, and Senator Hirono, maybe you can address this first. What's the one thing that regular people, people in the community can do to ensure that our rights to vote are protected? What are some of the things just the average person in the AAPI community can do to ensure we protect these very important rights?
Well, individuals matter. One person can make a difference. So what an individual can do is, of course, to vote, and then to, if they are of the mind, and I hope they are, is to work in collective action to organize at the local level, because the voting, as our voting rights are taken away, it's going to require, in my view, not only individuals going out to vote, but organized efforts to enable people to go out to vote and do all the things that we need to do, because all these voting rights, taking away voting rights, these laws are being enacted at the state level. And clearly the people who are running for state legislatures matter. They are the ones who are passing all these voter suppression bills, as well as effecting gerrymandering of districts. And so organizing at the local level is really critical right now. And that's what I would do. You know, everybody, voting is a right, but it's also a responsibility. Don't allow people to take it away. And as Judy was talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act and others, we have a history of discriminatory actions against minority groups in our country. Yes, the Black community, very much so, but the Asian community, yes, through the internment, the Chinese Exclusion Act, more recently, the Muslim ban. And so we have a history of discrimination in our country, and we need to be very alert to that and fight back at every turn. But it starts with each of us taking the responsibility to vote. And I want to mention one more thing. Remember when we were doing the census and there were efforts to impose a citizenship requirement? That was yet another way to totally undercount minority people in our country, APIAs included, of course. So these efforts to suppress our voices continue.
Congresswoman Chu, your thoughts on what us average people can do to help push this fight forward?
Well, actually, everyday people can have a lot of influence on what's going on in the federal level, the state level, and the local level. First of all, on the federal level, you can help us pass these very, very important bills. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which would then restore the pre-clearance for areas that have shown to have discriminatory behavior in voting, and also the Freedom to Vote Act, which did get proposed in the Senate and had such fundamental things such as guarantee early voting and no excuse voting and same day registration and voting. The great thing about these federal bills is that they would provide protection all across the United States, regardless of what a state legislature might do to take away these rights. But then there is the state. I mean, yes, we are stuck on the federal level because of this filibuster, but the struggle then is to make sure these states don't pass these terrible laws. And of course, where are we seeing this? In Texas and Georgia. Now, it would be particularly horrendous in Georgia because I feel like we made great strides there in the 2020 election. But that precisely is the reason why in Georgia they want to clamp down on the vote and make it more impossible for new voters to actually exercise their vote. And by the way, who were amongst the new voters? A whole lot of AAPIs, 30,000 new voters in Georgia. I mean, I like to think we take credit for why Joe Biden won that state and why Ossoff and Warnock won their Senate seats. So yes, the battle has to be on the state level as well. And then there's the local level. I mean, even in my area, now in California, of course, we have excellent voting rights laws and excellent voting leaders in the state. But on the local level, I would urge everybody that can to watch that election process, be involved as a poll worker, make sure you're on top of what's going on with voting rights, because there are a lot of struggles that happen on the local level. I mean, just in a city in my district, a Chinese immigrant person, I think legitimately won the right to be elected to the local city council. And then the longtime old residents challenged it by alleging that Chinese poll workers were talking to voters in their language in Chinese, and therefore people couldn't hear it, and therefore they were cheating. I mean, we had a big fight. It sounds ridiculous, but we had a big fight on that. And it's only because people came out and banded together and said, no, we have to uphold our democratic process, that we're actually able to prevail.
That's a very compelling story. And I think those types of stories are what we need our community to bring out more of and use as evidence in pushing forward the legislation supporting voter access that we need so much right now. And Congressman, like you say, the federal law would create kind of a baseline protection. Of course, states are free to have longer, early voting periods, but we need that federal base protection. And I think you're absolutely right that everybody should be working at all levels of government, federal, state, and local, to ensure that voting rights are protected. Senator Hirono, I was wondering if you have any stories or have heard stories in the voting context that come from either your constituents or from all your work with the Judiciary Committee?
Stories
of voter experiences, either good or bad. I think one of the things we saw in 2020 was other forms of voting becoming very popular because obviously people didn't want to be in crowds during the pandemic. And so we know there are good stories from that, but just curious if you have any stories to relate in that regard.
The stories that are the ones that we've all heard, how places like Georgia, Texas, and other places, literally dozens of laws have been enacted that that restrict who can vote, that require certain kinds of IDs that are hard for certain groups, minority groups to get, that make it illegal to pass out food and water to people who are standing in line, usually in minority communities. So these are very, very targeted kinds of laws that are intended to make it much, much harder for minority people to vote. So those are the stories that we've all heard, and it's blatant. The proponents of these kinds of laws don't even try to hide their intentions. They are right there. And in fact, at one of the hearings before the Supreme Court, I think Justice Barrett asked I don't even remember what state's law, it might have been Texas, why are you doing this? And basically the person admitted, well, it's so that minority people would have a much tougher time voting. So they are blatant about it. And thanks to this Supreme Court, with Shelby County that set aside the Voting Rights Act, and then followed by yet another major decision that not very many people talk about, but the remaining part of the Voting Rights Act was made that much harder. That was another section of the Voting Rights Act that the Justice Department have been using to go after some of these laws that makes it even harder to prove. So we do not have a friendly Supreme Court. Our Supreme Court is very, very conservative, to say the least, and you will see all these 6-3 and 5-4 decisions that will not protect minority rights, that will not protect a woman's right to choose, LGBTQ rights, clearly gerrymandering, and just you name it. And so that's another reason that voting is so important, because the party that controls and the presidency gets to nominate the vacancies and finally, I'm looking forward to my 4th Supreme Court justice hearing, and this person will be eminently qualified, and she will add to the diversity so needed in our courts, and that reflect the diversity much more, the diversity of our country. And we're not sure what the Republicans are going to come up with, but you already see the ads attacking her as being a tool of dark money, when it's like the kettle calling the pot black, or whatever that saying is, where you have these right-wing people who have spent millions and millions of dollars to get these people onto the last 3 justices onto the Supreme Court. So the hypocrisy is rank, but there you have it. So these are the stories that I hear in the Judiciary Committee every day that we have hearings.
I think, Senator, that's absolutely right, and we need that evidence to help you guys, push the not just voting rights, but so many other important bills. Not to mention the nominee that will be before you in just a few weeks. I'd like to just wrap up with one question for the both of you, and that is, how would you encourage more AAPIs to take the plunge and run for office, given how tough a thing it is to put yourself out there? Congresswoman Chu?
Well, it is so important to get involved with the programs that expose you to government. I mean, I am a great admirer of the APAC's internship and fellowship programs, but actually there are a number of internship programs that we have now that have really proliferated to encourage people to be placed in offices so that they can see how government works. It helps a lot because, 70% of our Asian population, of our Asian adult population, are immigrants, and they may not have had the exposure to government that they can pass on to their kids, or even, well, of course, to themselves, to have the familiarity with government to even contemplate running. So the first step is being really familiar with how government works and what it takes to get there. But there are actually things that they can do beyond that. They can get involved with their local advocacy organizations or commissions. Like, how about trying to be a commissioner in your local city or county? That's a really great way to learn how government works, and also to make some decisions. Like being on a planning commission, that's really important and influences the future of your city. So doing that can give you the first step, the first taste on how you make important government decisions. The other thing is volunteering on a campaign. There you really get the nuts and bolts of what it takes to run for office. There are the great things, you know, the wonderful election nights where everybody's cheering, but you also have to know how hard it is. You have to know what it's like to knock at somebody's door and get it slammed in your face, or to have, you know, these ugly attack ads against you. And you have to know what it's like to mobilize tons and tons of campaign volunteers to work with you and to be motivated to continue to work with you. So that is a truly great learning experience. So any or all of those things can really help in getting more AAPIs to run for office.
Oh, thank you so much. And Senator Hirono, that was pretty comprehensive, but would you please, if you have any other thoughts on that?
Yes. It starts with as an individual caring about something so much that you want to do something about it. For me, I was an anti-war protester, and that led me to wanting to do something besides marching and singing "We Shall Overcome." And there's a group of advocates who are my friends. We all decided that you have to have seats at the table. But I think very much that it starts with in your heart to care about something so much that you want to be at the table to affect the decision making on that subject. And then you start to figure out what kind of experiences you can get in order to get a seat at the table. And yes, I started by helping other people get elected and all of those other kinds of things that will expose you. But I do think that it starts with a commitment in your heart that you want to make a difference. And what I see among young people is this kind of desire and determination. Look at all the DACA people who came every day to try and get us to support what they were doing. I can't wait to give them the right to become citizens, because they already know how to organize, and they're going to start running for office, and they're going to bring to the office experiences that are much needed in political decision making. Look at all the people who, the young people who advocate for safe gun safety laws and all of that. And I see so much commitment among so many young people for climate change, for gun legislation, for LGBTQ rights. I do think that, and women's right to choose, it starts with that burning desire, really, to be a part of the change.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Senator, and Congresswoman Chu as well, for such inspiring conversation with us. I think we'll all heed your advice and keep the effort and the fight going. For us, it's all about the vote. So, you know, there's so many other issues out there that we need to inspire, organize, and energize the community over. But, you know, it all starts with the vote. So again, thank you both so much for your generous time. And with that, I know you guys have busy days. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you everybody who's on this end. It's always good to see you, Judy. Thank you for your advocacy. You know.
Thank you, Senator Hirono, for being there. Our most important voice there.
All of us. You. Aloha.
Aloha.
Bye.
Wow, what a real treat that was to be able to hear from two distinguished politicians here in Washington, D.C. We have real quick before I hand it over to Christine Chen for a quick wrap up. I wanted to show a quick video from Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy, who was going to join us but was not able to, but wanted to present a quick greeting to everybody. So if we can share that, we'll run that, and then Christine will wrap everything up.
Hi, everybody. I'm Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy of the 8th District of Illinois. I want to say a special thank you to APIA Vote for inviting me to this event. APIA Vote continues to be dedicated to growing the AAPI communities toward greater electoral and civic participation. And this right to vote is more important than ever as many state legislatures try to limit that right and as our community faces increasing discrimination and hate crimes. We are all touched by the hand of government through housing policy, economic initiatives, and social services. The conversations that happen within the walls of the U.S. Capitol make their way across bridges, roads, and rivers to every citizen of all 50 states. The AAPI community needs to have a say in all of these matters. What is the best way to do that? Vote. That's the best way to have a say. If you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And voting makes sure that you have a seat at the table. So thank you so much again to APIA Vote for inviting me. And I look forward to collaborating with you going forward. Thank you.
Thank you once again to Senator Hirono and Congresswoman Chu and Congressman Krishnamurthy for your wisdom and advice. Everyone, you heard it from them, some great ideas on what needs to be done and how to get out the vote. Now that you've been inspired, we need you to go ahead and take action. We know that during the 2020 election cycle, almost 3 out of 4 APIs voted early or by mail. The Brennan Center also reported that in 2021, 19 states passed 34 restrictive laws. And already within 2 months of this year, 250 restrictive bills were introduced in state legislators across the country. The onslaught against voting rights and voter access clearly continues. So many of these laws have been directly aimed at the ways the API community has overwhelmingly preferred to vote. Arizona made purging voters off absentee ballot mailing lists easier. Florida is restricting who can provide assistance in returning a ballot. Georgia is reducing the number of ballot drop boxes and making it illegal to provide water to people stuck in long polling lines. This week in Texas, in the Texas primary, we know there were plenty of confusion around new ID requirements, which made the absentee ballot process much more difficult, with thousands of ballots getting rejected. Other restrictive provisions in the Texas law includes limits on who can assist a voter in returning a ballot, reducing access to polling places, limiting early voting opportunities, and making the voter registration process more difficult. So this is how you can help. Share your own experience as you did today in the chat. So share your own experience in voting, and also urge people to tag their voting experiences and stories, whether it's positive or negative. And make sure you use the hashtag AAPIs for voting rights. One of our comm staff members will also be putting this in the chat, so that way you could also copy and paste that. Also follow API Vote on social media and participate in our campaign to ignite discussion and educate people about their local voter laws and the importance of voting rights. Once again, this will also be available in the chat. The other thing is promote the joint Asian American midterm election strategy session on March 31st. Join us. It's hosted by Asian American Advancing Justice, AAJC, and API Vote. We will continue to provide a landscape from a community standpoint, also of what federal and state legislation looks like in 2022, and share best practices from local partners from their 2020 voter protection and ongoing litigation efforts. We need your help to raise the awareness of what's going on specifically in your own state. There's going to be a lot of competing interests and distractions, but we need to make sure that voting and access to the ballot box continues to be in the forefront. Everyone needs your help to make a new plan to vote so your vote is not suppressed come election day. And you need to let others know that they cannot take the right to vote for granted. So thank you everyone for joining us today and more importantly, taking action. And a special thank you to the API Vote entire staff for organizing this great briefing. Thank you and have a great weekend.